Salutations, ladies and gentlemen, the Knife Raven here, back again with another video. And in today's video, it's a nice gray day outside. Clouds look like they could let loose with rain any moment. And the air is cool and crisp, just the way I like it. And it's on days like this that I like to gaze out the window as I sit down and decide to film a video on a knife that, to me, represents and encapsulates the beauty of nature around me. And pardon the little, if you will, philosophical intro, but I just felt that there was something there that I needed to say. But nonetheless, today I'll be taking a look at a knife that I've had for nearly 2 years. And it remains perhaps one of the most beautiful knives I have. And it is easily one of the most famous knives, particularly for traditionals. And it is arguably France's most famous folder, with the only possible contender really being the Opinel. Now, my long-term viewers would know that I quite enjoy the Opinel for its utilitarian simplicity, its ease of purchase, its cost effectiveness, and its quality. But for the knife here today, some of these things cannot be said. However, it does have the advantage of being far, far, far more sophisticated. And while the Opinel does radiate perhaps the traditional old world aesthetic, it doesn't encapsulate the same, how shall I put it, refined nature that this knife does. And this knife, which is known as the Laguiole, and I have heard many pronunciations. Some include Laguiole, Laguiole, and Laguiole. And while no one can truly agree on the proper pronunciation, the most frequently heard to me is Laguiole. And if you wish to correct me, you may do so, but from now on, that's what this knife shall be known as. Now, the Laguiole dates back well over 100, closer to 200 years, and it originally was a shepherd's knife, a tool used by farmers and sheep herders, and it was a very basic piece, probably akin to the Opinel. But over the years, as it became more and more popular, the aristocracy took a liking to its design and began to order batches of these in much finer materials and more heavy emphasis on the quality and finish of them, which eventually caused this knife to evolve into the elegant piece of art that it is today. Whereas once upon a time, it used to be a workhorse of a knife, and more of a blade of utility, less of a blade of elegance. And today, the Laguiole is still very popular in both of its forms. I have seen many who appreciate the matte finished Laguiole, which involves no polish to the blade, perhaps more of a satin finish, and brushed steel for the bolsters instead of either polished brass or nickel silver. The handles can vary in levels of price and exotic value. The cheaper ones include rosewood, oak, juniper, olive, and such, and the more exquisite ones, which include things like stag, horn, snakewood, ironwood, mother of pearl, and many others. So the Laguiole is a very customizable knife in that sense, where it can be really created to be a knife for everyone, whether you're looking for a conversation piece, a table knife, or just an everyday use carry knife. Chances are you'll find a Laguiole that suits you in one way or another. Now, this model, which is made by the company Laguiole Le Fidele, is a French company, and they've been around for some time, not as long as the oldest of the Laguiole makers. And there has been a debate in the community of French knife collectors that has never truly been rectified, and that is that only real Laguioles can be made in the village of Laguiole itself. The only authentic Laguiole knife is from the village that holds its name. Now, this has sparked debate, as there are some who say that as long as it's made in France, it is authentic. For example, there are many Thiers brands that make Laguioles, and many say that those are just as authentic as ones made in the village itself. And of course, the argument that authentic models come from the village itself are helped by the story, whether true or not, that Napoleon Bonaparte himself gave the right exclusively to the Laguiole villagers to make this knife as a symbol of their bravery in battle. Now, again, this has been widely disputed. Some have said that that isn't a true story. Others have said that it is, and therefore only the villagers of Laguiole can make this knife. But I digress. Whether you choose to believe that this is not an authentic one, or whether you believe it is, that's entirely up to you. However, this knife, even though it isn't made in the village of Laguiole, is still made in France, by hand, in the old school way that you would expect from such a folding knife. And this knife has some very interesting little features to it that I quite enjoy. To begin, the style of this knife is incredibly slender, sleek, and ergonomic. It's refined, has unbeatable class and elegance to it. Again, it's a fairly large knife, certainly not cumbersome or unwieldy, but I will give you a measurement on it. The knife comes in at an overall length of about 7 3/4 inches. On the handle, about 4 1/4. And the blade, it's just about 3 3/4 inches overall, with the cutting edge just being around 3 1/4. So this knife would not be legal for UK carry without a good reason. Even so, this knife does not have a lock. It is a slip joint, which means that, again, you have a spring that the blade is connected to, and when you open the knife, the spring locks into place and keeps the knife solid, but enough strength, and you can push the blade, thus disengaging the spring and letting you close the knife. However, again, compared to a lockback, where when you open the blade, the lock bar engages and is not disengageable until you press on the lock bar, allowing you to close the knife. So this knife is, while safe to use, it isn't technically a locking knife. Now, the blade, which is considered a lazy clip point or Yatagan style, is mostly known as a French blade shape, although clip point designs have existed for many, many years before the Laguiole did. Here's an example, however, of a more recent French knife, again, the Opinel. This knife was designed in the 1890s, and it features a clip point blade of a different shape. You can see these are, in the end, similar blade shapes, but where the clip begins and ends is vastly different. Also, the price point on this knife is far, far lower. But even so, the blade shape is utilitarian enough. It makes for an excellent slicer due to the thin stock. The edge is flat ground, so it's a very thin, fine edge. Again, with that beautiful mirror polish, which admittedly is quite the fingerprint magnet. The steel is 12C27, although the stamping is far from perfect. And below it says France, as this is indeed a made in France folding knife. The bolsters are polished brass, as are the pins, liners, and another feature of a traditional Laguiole is the shepherd's cross. The shepherd's cross is a design that often is featured on traditional Laguioles, and on the center pin on one side of the knife, there are 5 extra smaller pins that are aligned in the shape of a cross. And this is a very historic feature on the Laguiole, and again, the reasoning behind this, I believe, is due to the fact that this was once a knife made for shepherds. Another feature on many Laguioles is the bee, or as some may have argued, the fly, but the bee is the more common story. It is right at the connection from the spring to the blade, and while this one is welded on, the best Laguioles out there, the most expensive, made by Forge de Laguiole in the village of Laguiole, are part of the spring. It's all one forged piece. But slightly less expensive Laguioles, they are forged, rather than being forged, they are welded on. And the very cheap ones that you should avoid from countries outside of France are often glued. And that is something you really do not want to see. But the bee has some nice detailing in it. As with the rest of the spring, this is known as guillochage, which is another way of saying file work, as we often know it. All hand done, and each piece can vary slightly, but you can see that there's a nice vine pattern in the back, and you can feel it. Again, the guillochage continues onto the bee and up to about halfway down the blade, giving this knife quite the artistic embellishment. Another fact about the bee is, and this is more of a rumor than a fact, it's that, again, symbolizes Napoleon, as he was known as being the busy bee, who was always out and doing things. He was never known to be a particularly lazy or slothful individual. And they say that the busy bee is his trademark, if you will. And thus, many Laguioles have had this placed upon them as a symbol of that. Again, this is a rumor. It is not confirmed. And I am not going to approach it as if it were a true fact. So aside from the very artistic embellishments on the back, on the blade itself, right by Laguiole Le Fidele, which is stamped into the blade, you can see their logo, which is a canine. Again, quite detailed for such a small mark. Not too far from the nail nick. But again, a very reflective polish on the blade. The steel, 12C27, is fair in quality. It certainly isn't the most premium steel in the world, but it's far from bad. I have many knives with 12C27 Sandvik. These include, again, stainless steel opinels, Letier Izard knives, a Nogent folding pruner, or pardon me, paring knife, and the Laguiole. And I've noticed that the steel, while definitely not the hardest in the world, is easy enough to sharpen. It's not the easiest, but it's far from the most difficult. It holds an edge for a fair amount of time, and it has excellent corrosion resistance. I've never had rust issues with any of my 12C27 knives. So it's a good mid-range steel. I know that some other brands make Laguioles in carbon steel, such as XC90 or XC75. Those are more often the matte finished, user-friendly models. And I know Forged Laguiole themselves use a steel known as T12. It's a steel that I believe they may have even invented, and I don't know how well it holds up against the 12C27. Again, I do not have a Forged Laguiole knife. I intend to eventually, but in the meantime, all I can go off of is the simple description that they're not too far apart, with T12 perhaps being a little bit better. But aside from the steel, these are genuine pieces of ebony wood. Again, a close-grained hardwood that is well known for being very, very dark, very elegant contrast to the gold of the brass and the silver of the steel. The spring tension is fairly decent. I'd say that this would probably rank at about a 5 on my personal spring rating, if you will. I can certainly confirm that it is stronger than some knives, but definitely weaker than others. For example, I'd say it's stronger than, say, this knife, the 3-rivet by Ottermesser of Zollingen. However, it would be a lot weaker than the Arthur Wright & Son Barlow, which is still one of the strongest springs I have to this day. As for the quality of this knife, there is no blade play whatsoever. The blade is very stable, very secure. Gapping is not really an issue here. If I hold it up to the light, there is a slight gap right here between the spring and the liner, right around there. But aside from that, it isn't really an issue. The transitions from the worked bolsters to the handles, very, very good. You can hardly feel it. And the pins are extremely smooth, even on the shepherd's cross. The polish is beautiful. Stamping on the blade is well done. The guillochage is masterful. So my only real complaints about these particular knives, and this is more a generalized gripe, if you will. It's simply, the first fact is that, well, when you have a welded-on B instead of a forged one, naturally there's always a higher risk that it could fall off. And this one has not fallen off, but that is just an unfortunate fact that I wish more makers did the forged approach rather than the welding, as to me it would at least make me feel a little safer with my knife and less likely to worry about anything happening to it. But I can understand if it is perhaps more costly or something. But I would like to see more makers do the forged approach rather than the welding. My other gripe, and this is again about Laguioles in general, very few have avoided this, is on a lot of old French knives there is no stop pin, which means that nothing is to stop the blade from slamming down and hitting the back of the spring, and thus chipping the edge. Now this has happened to me on this particular knife before, and I have to always remind myself that not all knives have stop pins, and not all knives are safe to snap shut, as I am used to being able to simply close my knives as so, without any worries of blade chipping. Whereas with the Laguiole, you always have to remember that when you're closing it, instead of just snapping it shut, you have to walk it down as to not damage the edge. Now, while many have said that this is merely how they were always made, and this is historical. They don't want to change the design. I suppose I see that, and that makes sense to me, but I feel with modern knives and modern technology, a simple stop pin is vastly far away from being a design change. It's a very small detail that you don't even really notice, but it could help the knife out immensely, as it would eliminate the chance of damaging your edge. And personally, I would like to see more makers do this, as I don't want to have to always be worried about accidentally closing my knife a little bit too hard and then having a nice chip in my edge. But that's just me. Oh, and if I didn't mention prior, as you probably have seen, while there is a nail nick, there is plenty of blade to pinch the knife open. The knife includes a leather pouch made in France with a belt loop secured by brass. There's the B emblem again. Simple clasp. Close the knife and just slide it in, close the sheath, and you now have a belt carry option. Now I can see this being immensely helpful, as a knife such as this with its pristine quality and shine, I wouldn't want to scratch it against anything else that may be in my pockets. So having the ability to put it in a protective case, as I drop it, would be immensely helpful. And while this isn't always included, where I bought this was Lee Valley Tools, an ironic place to find such a pristine knife, I know. But at Lee Valley, you can choose to either get the knife, get the sheath of the knife, or get them as a bundle deal, and you get a discount by doing so. And I naturally went with the latter, as I didn't want to buy a knife without a sheath when I could have a sheath. And I think that this is a beautiful addition, as not only does it keep your knife safe, but again, the brown contrasts beautifully with, again, the brass, the steel, and the ebony. And I think that a classy leather pouch is certainly something that any good traditional knife could work well with. But either way, the knife came to about 144 Canadian when I purchased it, which is far from expensive compared to some of the other Laguioles you can get well into the $300 and $400 US price range. But it is certainly far away from the Opinel, which is, again, the other popular French knife, and these can cost you around, well, less than 20 Canadian dollars. You can get these for as cheap as 12 or 15. So naturally, there is a difference in styling and finish. These are factory made, these are handmade, these don't really have any finishing to them, these have a lot of finishing to them. So you can understand the cost jump, but it's far from, it's far from unreasonable, but at the same time, it's not what I would call a budget knife. But if you're interested in a classy, traditional style knife with a lot of history, and again, you can find these in many handle materials. The ebony was the only one available at the time, but you can find these in quite a few places. Most are either from the USA or France itself, but you can find this in quite the selection of handles, if you so wish. So again, thank you very much for watching. This has been a re-review, if you will, on a knife I've had for almost 2 years, and I thoroughly enjoy it. I think that it's a great knife. I don't carry it as a user, but rather as a personal steak knife. Its profile is amazing, and the sharpness of its blade and the kind of grind it has makes it excellent for slicing through tough gristle and fat. And if you wish for something a bit simpler, again, you can always have something like this as a table knife, but to me, I like something a bit more refined. Again, I fancy myself an individual with expensive taste. Such is a curse, but either way. Nonetheless, thank you very much for watching. This has been the Laguiole Le Fidele Laguiole knife with the leather pouch and the ebony wood handles. And this has been the Knife Raven, as always, signing off. Goodbye, and au revoir.